Guybrush Threepwood? That's the stupidest name I've ever heard.
If, like me, you're fast approaching 40, you will have grown up playing point-and-click adventure games. If you didn't grow up playing the likes of The Secret of Monkey Island, Day of the Tentacle, Beneath the Steel Sky, then congratulations on waking up this morning without various aches and pains. The Secret of Monkey Island, developed by Lucasfilm and released in 1990, and yes, that was 30 years ago, was, most people would agree, the game that put point-and-click adventures on the map, opening the way for a flood of similar titles. Now, you couldn't call it a resurgence, but we have seen echoes of that classic adventure game genre in modern games like Life is Strange and Telltale's series of decision-based story games, for example. But what we see in those games is those old-school puzzles being largely dropped for the moral choice and the branching story elements. Alex Kanaris-Sotiriou and Tom Jones are co-founders of a new studio called Polygon Treehouse. Their debut game, Röki, is a sort of modernised point-and-click game rooted in Scandinavian folklore. But the question is, how do you take that old yet beloved genre that is the point-and-click and give it relevance and update it? How do you get back to the essence of what made a game like Monkey Island what it is without it feeling out of date? Not only that, how do you give it a compelling modern narrative that means something to people? I spoke to Alex about taking on the unenviable task of bringing the point and click back to life. Join me as we take a look at the making of Polygon Treehouse's debut game, Röki.
We started off with the Scandinavian folklore aspect of it, and then we're like, okay, but we want to tell a meaningful story as well. One of the key inspirations on the folklore side was a tragic kind of monster in the Moomins called the Grok, who would be really scary and being petrified as a child, that would just slowly move towards the village, like freezing everything in its path, like people and everything. Right. But basically, it just wanted a friend. And so that was like really tragic. It's like, almost got a friend. I've almost got a friend. Oh, they're frozen. You know, it's really sad, but actually it's kind of tragic, and there's a really human aspect to it. So we knew we wanted a human aspect to the story. What we tried to do, I guess, is try and make things reflect each other. So basically, you'll have like different things in the game will kind of cast like a narrative reflection on other bits. Röki's mother, like their kind of mother, like parent-child relationship, reflecting in like Tuve and her families, like having like counterpoints to actually realize there's two sides to this story, but they kind of reflect on each other, like intertwine the two. But probably the jumping off point for us was the kind of the creatures of Scandinavian folklore and the monsters, and the fact that they felt so like strange and sometimes magic. I hadn't actually considered how perilous this was until after I read like a preview, which was actually making kids in video games is really hard because they have a tendency to be like massively annoying, or whining. It wasn't until I read this that I was like, oh my goodness, what were we thinking? It could have been a horrible disaster, but because we wanted to tell quite an emotional story with a strong connection to the character, that was probably the first one. We were like, okay, that's the way we'd like to move away from the classic point and click of having a cursor and basically clicking on the point in the world and having the character move there, to you taking direct control of the character. And that's something that automatically makes it feel more contemporary, and also in a strange way you're kind of removing the barriers of connection between you and the character.
Mama?
Instead of a fully voice-acted script, Röki uses a vocal emote system. It's a variety of different chuckles, sighs, frustrated groans, and so on. These emotes accompany each piece of dialogue and lend it the correct inflection and tone, and it works beautifully, thanks in no small part to Tuve's voice actor, Ingvild Daler.
We were very lucky to find Ingvild, who played Tuve, and actually a lot of the things, like we just kind of we obviously gave her all the information of what we wanted, and we just kind of let run with it and be playful with it in the recording session, which I think is where a lot of those kind of improvised, some of those ones like come across really well. And I think it was really important for us that Tuve still remain quite like optimistic and playful in some ways, because otherwise there's danger that we never want the game to feel onerous or like they're like it was there always needs to be some relief there. It's a big part of her character that she can go into the wilderness and meet these monsters and still be kind of quite fearless and inquisitive and playful. It was a really kind of critical part of the story we were trying to tell.
One element of all point and clicks that has definitely aged frankly horribly is the classic infuriating puzzle, or that moment when you just get completely stuck and end up trying to use one item in your inventory on every other item until something happens. These days the games market is saturated, so in an age where you can play a game on every screen in your home, it's vital to balance challenge with respecting the player's time.
I'm definitely much time poorer than I was when I was 10. And so, yeah. And I imagine, obviously a lot of people are the same. I think just life in general, there's so much more stuff going on. But I think it comes back to, in looking at kind of classic adventure games and the stuff that people find frustrating now. One is like puzzles not really having like a really hard wall you might hit, and having the game offering no way around that wall unless you kind of suddenly figure out how to flip over it. It's very difficult of balancing the puzzles so that there's a challenge there, but that if the penny doesn't drop immediately, and so then it's like, well, how do you then have a challenge and maybe that the first thing they might try might lead them on to something else. So it's all about that kind of allowing assists for different players of different like puzzle solving ability to get through. There's like the famous, obviously Monkey Island 2 is one of my favorites, but there's a thing where you use a monkey as a monkey wrench is a little bit of a stretch. We try to make sure that if you need to use an object for something, or you're presented with a problem an obstacle that you have to overcome, you're like, okay, well, I probably need something that in the real world would help me with that.
As you might expect from a studio headed up by 2 art directors, the game's environment and sense of place were high on the priorities list. Environments couldn't just be a background to which you solve puzzles, they had to feel lived in and real. Not only that, but the player's actions within the world had to have a tangible impact.
We wanted the idea of like not just like you'd have a location that you'd visit and you'd solve a puzzle and you'd move on. Like it was like you were almost like you're uncovering the layers of this folklore onion, and then but you'd be returning to places and seeing them maybe in a slightly different context, or you'll get them to them early on, but then you'll be able to see a different aspect of them. Like a really good example of that is the graveyard, in the fact that you get there to start off with. And you can go and examine all the gravestones, because that was you could do that in the early demos that we had, and that's a part of the planting puzzle seeds.
Yes.
And then you having the kind of aha moment of like, oh, that's for that, and that's kind of one of those things where it kind of just make the tapestry of the game feel quite rich, and it has depth, because there are things you encounter which then will have a hidden meaning later on. I think the kind of sense of exploration in the kind of second and third acts of Röki is really strong, and maybe that's down to like the Metroidvania aspects that we've kind of brought into it, and also down to the kind of direct control and the 3D nature of the kind of exploration that does make you feel like you're kind of going on an adventure. But I think that's the other thing as well, like when you're making anything, whether it's an adventure game or a fighting game or a racing game, or you're making a movie or a documentary or whatever, like you're writing a fantasy novel, you always want to draw on inspirations outside of the genre of thing that you're making.
Yeah.
And so because otherwise you'll end up making something that's very like generic or typical of that genre. I've worked on games in the past where I've had to work for months and months and months on doing cutscenes that people just skipped.
Yeah.
Like early on in like PS2 times, and I think that's it's kind of like a really difficult thing to do those things. Well, of course, they need like lots of time investment in art and animation, all that, and cinematography. So we just tried to basically put all the story in the gameplay rather than as you enter an area, and it's like, really telling you up front what everything is, like you telling the story and building a picture of the world and the events that have taken place by going around and looking at things, like as an active thing, like you, the player, you're actively going and doing these things, examining things and like building up a story of the game world. There'll be players who are playing it with different abilities. There'll also be people who want to wallow in the lore and really absorb it all and find out every last bit. And there'll be the people who would just want the kind of headline story of like, I want, to go through. So having those things as like optional things that people can explore and find all the secret bits it's kind of offering different ways for different people to play the game. And the journal was a kind of a big part of that as well. And so she'll go to a new area, she'll scribble a bit on the map and make some notes about the things she's seen. And it allows quality of life for kind of like puzzle tracking, like where different things were. And also like some guidance. If you're stuck with things, you can go and read through the journal and there'll be some stuff in there that might give you a steer. It was actually really interesting from a narrative point of view to have as a kind of second voice for Tuve that was different from the thoughts and the feelings that she would feel confident enough to express verbally in the world. The stuff that she'd write down on her kind of hopes and fears were maybe slightly more like intimate in kind of like and like how like she would feel inside her head. She had this kind of external and internal voices, which actually provided it from a narrative point of view was cool. It was a really good opportunity to go like, okay, well, I'm feeling like bravado in the outside, but then you can find out that it's actually just very worried about something, the notes in the journal, and that just makes her feel more real as a character.
Slowly we are starting to see more diversity in video game characters, but lack of representation is still an issue, and it limits the industry's storytelling potential. When your protagonist isn't an angry man with amnesia or sporting a 5 o'clock shadow and a thirst for vengeance, you give yourself that freedom to write a more sophisticated, more grown-up story, a story people can relate to.
The story of Röki is connected with people in the kind of it's like quite a powerful way that maybe we didn't expect. There's been a few instances where people have like sent us messages and explained their own kind of personal circumstances and basically saying like, always when you get messages from people who are playing the game around launch, it's always like, is it going to be a bug? Is it going to say they like it? It's a bit Russian roulette. I guess I'm trying to like labour some of those things, but they were considered and they were there as part of the story. It was very much a story of Tuve and her family. But yeah, I think it's safe to say we've been really touched and delighted by like the reviews and people's feedback on the story. So from the conception of the story, like Tuve was always there. I think it's just what felt more interesting for us to do as like a story. Like it was a more interesting story with Tuve going to rescue her brother rather than the other way around. You're this child going into the world and you can face all these obstacles, but by the strength of your character, even though you may have moments of doubts and you'll have had things in your past you'll need to overcome, that you can still get through it with the help of your friends, even if the friends are monsters. Actual monsters.